Urban fantasy. This ain't your grandma's fantasy subgenre. No sir. This is fantasy, but in a leather jacket. It rides a motorcycle and loves darts. It's dating your mum. I'm getting carried away, but what I'm saying is urban fantasy, at least to me personally, has always felt like the edgier corner of the genre. In a nutshell, urban fantasy is a fictional story told using fantasy elements we're familiar with, like magic and monsters, but in a world that we can recognize as our own. The social cultures will almost always stay the same. It gets a bit more interesting than just that, but we'll get to that in just a bit. I have a bit of an interesting relationship with urban fantasy, where some of my favorite stories do fall into this category while still not being in love with the larger premise, magic and monsters in our real world. My preference would be a completely fictional fantasy world with unfamiliar, remarkable locations, fun made-up currencies, and food. And yet, I still find myself reading and loving urban fantasy quite a bit, especially recently. Anyway, today I want to take a bit of a closer look into this subgenre, what works for me, what doesn't, and more importantly, I want to see how you feel about these types of stories. What's shaking? My name's Cam, welcome back to another video. I make lots of videos on fantasy and horror books, so if that's your kind of thing, then I would love it if you stuck around. Urban fantasy is a particular branch of fantasy that I've always had a bit of a weird time with. It's definitely not my go-to, and in most cases I find it kind of hit or miss. But recently I've been reading quite a lot of urban fantasy, and it's given me very kind of conflicted feelings. I've been reading Dresden Files, which has been pretty interesting so far. I have a video on that, so you can check that out if you want. I also have just finished 2 of 3 books in the Greenbone saga by Fonda Lee, which so far is an incredible series, and I will be doing a video on that a bit later. Dresden Files in particular are a set of stories that I think don't only work well in spite of being urban fantasy, but I think they actually work the best because of that. I will elaborate on that, but first I want to mention a specific distinction within this subgenre that we should probably acknowledge. In urban fantasy, the fantastical elements may be secret to most of the common people, like the world of Harry Potter or Supernatural. All of this interesting stuff is happening out of sight in a way that doesn't disrupt the world as we know it. It should be pointed out that this is great for children or maybe people who are new to fantasy as a whole, because rather than overwhelming them with a Brandon Sanderson-sized catalogue of made-up places, power structures, and quality of life things, do they have working plumbing or do they have to poop in a hole? The secret fantasy world angle is fun because we get to see how normal people like the ones reading the book, might react to these fantasy things. Now, urban fantasy could also take the opposite approach and just say, hey, here's the world you know, but also there's wizards and everyone just kind of knows and they're cool with it. I think this one is a bit more rare, maybe because it requires a lot more effort to make it make sense. In the secret fantasy world story, we can very easily understand how most things work. There's familiar governments, economies, law enforcement, but when those things aren't a secret to the common populace, the reader has to start asking questions like, how would they regulate this? How would our government make sure that wizards aren't just using magic to get whatever they want and rule the world? Both of these options within urban fantasy still require a good deal of world building, and they're still require talent and skill to tell a good story, but I would argue that the secret world side of urban fantasy has the luxury of kind of drawing a line down the middle. Meanwhile, the other option requires essentially rebuilding our own world in a way that makes more sense to the common people in the story. I think, at least to me personally, one of the reasons I'm not as drawn to urban fantasy as I am to stories with an entirely fictional fantasy world is because I love the idea of being taken to a completely unfamiliar place. One of my favorite things is, for the first time, reading about a huge fantasy city. A big fantasy city filled with magical item peddling markets is a bit more exciting than an orc walking through the same Los Angeles that I see online every day. I really like not knowing what the next location is going to look like or what the culture there will be like, and I know urban fantasy can technically still do these things as well, but that feels like we're getting into separating it from the urban fantasy elements that we're talking about, specifically fantasy elements within a theoretically real world. The times that urban fantasy shines through, the times that it succeeds in truly drawing me in, is when they use that angle for the characters or the plot. For example, you could have Dresden's stories told in a fictional fantasy world, sure, but I think they work way better when they're told in our world. These stories lean heavily on the brooding private detective trope that we're so familiar with in the thriller and mystery genres. Urban fantasy, more than most other subgenres, has an awesome advantage. It can take those tropes outside of fantasy and use them in more fun and creative ways. Part of Harry Dresden's noir aesthetic that gives it so much flavor is the familiarity. It is seeing this powerful wizard dealing with issues that we have seen in the real world, like crime scenes, car troubles, or overdue bills. I just love the idea of imagining this magical being living in a dingy apartment, a lot like one of the ones that I've lived in. To give another example, the Greenbone Saga has been one of the most interesting approaches to urban fantasy that I've probably ever read, and because technically it does take place in a fictional world, and yet we see these characters using a fascinating magic system in tandem with very real-world things. They use stones of jade to imbue them with powers, but they're also vulnerable to things that in our world pose a huge threat, like G's. I'm gonna go ahead and call these G's because YouTube has been giving me grief over saying way less concerning words. Magic in the Greenbone Saga isn't just used as a crutch to make the story interesting. It's almost as if Fonda Lee outlined this entire story set within our real world with interesting characters, relationships, power struggles, and then added the fantasy stuff to amplify and to make this world of hers unique. I guess what I'm saying is, for urban fantasy to really hit the sweet spot for me, the fantasy elements have to complement the real world elements, or vice versa, rather than just having a story where one thing could be easily traded out for the other. Bit of a random side tangent, but while we're mentioning G's, this has always been one of the most difficult things in my opinion, both as a reader and as someone who has tried writing urban fantasy before, to implement in a fantasy story. I mean, for example, imagine Harry Potter, but with G's. I understand that there's probably spells that could protect you a bit, but honestly, all it would have taken was for one Death Eater to sneak up on Harry, whip out a G, and bam. The boy who got capped. It is incredibly hard to create or imagine a world where someone could be using a sword effectively when G's are an option. Although I do really appreciate when authors come up with clever ways around this. It's one of the things I really like about the genre. I do like that, but I had to mention this. G's in urban fantasy is a great example of how sometimes telling a magical story in our world can actually be harder than just building it from the ground up. If you were hoping to get a definitive answer out of me as to whether urban fantasy is good or bad, I'm sorry, that's just not how it works. There are some really great urban fantasy, but despite me loving so many of these types of stories, it's still not something I'm really drawn to as a subgenre. It's more so the stories that are drawing me in rather than the format that they're being told in. I'm not drawn to urban fantasy the same way I'm inherently drawn to found family, grand questline, traveling fantasy. But hey, it's a discussion, so what do you think? Are you a fan of urban fantasy or not? And why? If there's any other more particular subgenres or tropes within fantasy that you'd like me to make a discussion on, let me know. Otherwise, thanks for watching, especially for watching through the whole video. You are my favorite. I make lots of videos on fantasy and horror books, so if that's your kind of thing, I would love it if you stuck around. Otherwise, have a good one, happy reading, and I'll see you in the next video. Catch ya.